There's a voice that speaks constantly, and it's easy to mistake it for truth. It appears when everything around you becomes quiet. It replays past mistakes and turns small failures into something deeply personal. It speaks with such certainty that questioning it rarely even occurs to you. Over time it becomes familiar, and whatever feels familiar slowly begins to feel true. There's a moment most people recognize all too well. Nothing important is happening, yet your mind refuses to slow down. It pulls back something you once said, something you once did, something you wish you could undo. And that voice doesn't simply remind you of it, it judges you. It adds extra weight, transforming a simple moment into something that feels permanent. The unsettling part is that you trust it. But the Stoics noticed something different. They believed we are not disturbed by events themselves, but by the meaning we assign to them. Which means that voice inside your head is not an authority. It's more like a narrator, one that can distort things just as easily as it can guide you. The real danger is not that the voice exists. The danger is that most people were never taught how to respond to it. Think about a moment you regret. Not something dramatic, just something small and personal. Maybe you said something awkward. Maybe you delayed something important. Maybe you didn't act the way you wish you had. The moment itself passed, but your mind didn't let it go. It replayed it, analyzed it, and gradually attached meaning to it. What began as something simple slowly became heavier, almost like evidence, as if that one moment permanently defined who you are. And the more you replayed it, the more convincing it became. No one else needed to criticize you because the voice in your head had already taken over, repeating the same judgment again and again with greater certainty each time. Eventually, it didn't even feel like a thought anymore. It felt like a conclusion. And that is where the real weight begins. Not from what actually happened, but from what your mind decided it meant. Something subtle happens in those moments that most people never stop to notice. Your mind isn't just remembering events, it's interpreting them. It quietly shapes them and attaches meaning to them. It takes something temporary and makes it feel permanent. A small mistake becomes a reflection of your intelligence. A missed opportunity becomes a reflection of your worth. A moment of hesitation becomes a reflection of your character. Not because those meanings are necessarily real, but because your mind automatically fills in the gaps. And once that meaning attaches itself, it tends to stay. You don't just remember the event itself, you remember what you decided it meant about you. The Stoics understood this deeply. They saw how quickly the mind moves from simple observation to harsh judgment. One moment you're just noticing something, and the next moment you're defining it. Once that definition forms, it begins shaping everything that follows. Your mood shifts, your confidence drops, your actions start to adjust, all from a single thought that was never truly questioned. That is why those thoughts feel so convincing. They don't appear as possibilities, they appear as facts. The mind doesn't say, "This might mean something," it says, "This is what it means." And because it sounds like your own voice, you trust it without resistance. It feels natural, it feels justified, but that authority is not always earned, it's simply assumed. Once you begin to see that clearly, something starts to change. You realize that the voice inside your head is not a perfect guide, but a storyteller, one that can distort things just as easily as it can clarify them. Left unchecked, that storyteller begins to create patterns. It repeats the same interpretations over and over until they start to feel like identity. You begin expecting the same thoughts, anticipating the same judgments, and reacting in the same ways. Not because reality demands it, but because repetition made it familiar, and familiarity often feels like truth. But the moment you recognize that what you are hearing is interpretation rather than reality, you create distance. At first, that distance is small, almost invisible, but it changes everything. You are no longer completely inside the thought, you are observing it, and in that small space, something opens up. Because once you can clearly see a thought, it begins to lose some of its power over you. This is where a different kind of discipline begins. Not the kind that forces you to suppress thoughts or replace them with something artificial, but the kind that allows you to examine them. The Stoics never tried to silence the mind. They tried to understand it. They knew that peace does not come from eliminating thoughts, but from refusing to be ruled by them. And that doesn't require force, it requires awareness. Just a pause, just enough to question what you're hearing before you believe it. If you're trying to understand your own mind in this way, not to escape it, but to see it clearly, then subscribing is simply a choice. A small step toward clarity, toward discipline, toward becoming someone who is not controlled by every thought that appears, because the way you think shapes the way you live. And learning to see your thoughts clearly may be one of the most important things you ever do. The shift is subtle, but it is powerful. Instead of immediately accepting the voice, you begin to evaluate it. Instead of reacting automatically, you observe. Instead of identifying with every thought, you create a boundary between yourself and what your mind is producing. Over time, that boundary grows stronger. The voice may still speak. It may still replay moments and attach meaning to them, but it no longer holds complete authority. It becomes something you can listen to without automatically obeying. This idea was expressed simply in the reminder that you have power over your mind, not outside events. Understanding this is not just a philosophical idea, it is a practical realization. It means that although you cannot control everything that happens or every thought that initially appears, you can control what you do with them. You can choose to accept them, question them, or let them pass. That decision, repeated consistently, slowly reshapes the relationship you have with your own mind. What once felt overwhelming begins to feel manageable. What once felt like unquestionable truth begins to feel like possibility. And what once controlled you slowly starts losing its grip. Not because the voice disappeared, but because you stopped giving it unquestioned authority. You began to see it for what it really is, a process, not a verdict. And in that realization, the weight of those small moments begins to fade. They return to what they always were, temporary events that no longer carry exaggerated meaning. Part of the answer lies in how the mind presents its thoughts. Your inner voice rarely sounds like a suggestion, it sounds like a conclusion. It arrives fully formed with a tone that feels certain, final, and strangely authoritative. When it says something like, "You are not good enough," or "This will fail," it doesn't feel like a passing idea drifting through awareness. It feels like something already decided, something already proven. Because it carries that tone of certainty, you rarely question it. You accept it, not because you carefully examined it, but because it feels familiar, it sounds like you, and that similarity alone gives it credibility. Over time, this pattern becomes automatic. A thought appears. It feels true, and you move forward as if it were a fact. There is a quiet efficiency in how the mind operates. It does not want to analyze every thought from the beginning. Instead, it builds shortcuts. It learns patterns. It reacts quickly. It conserves effort. But that efficiency comes with a cost. When the mind becomes used to presenting thoughts as conclusions, it slowly stops distinguishing between what is accurate and what is simply habitual. A repeated thought begins to feel like a verified one. And the more often it appears, the less resistance it meets. It becomes easier to believe, not because it is correct, but because it is familiar. This is how certain ideas about yourself begin to take root without ever being tested. They are not examined, they are absorbed. As Carl Jung once said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Once that absorption happens, the voice in your head gains a quiet authority. It no longer needs to argue or present evidence. It simply states something and you follow. This is why even harsh thoughts can feel justified. They arrive with the same tone as your reasonable thoughts, the same sense of certainty, the same internal voice. There is no clear distinction between guidance and distortion because both are delivered in the same way. And without that distinction, it becomes difficult to separate what deserves your attention from what does not. Everything begins to feel equally valid simply because it originates from within. But if you slow this process down even slightly, something important begins to appear. The tone of certainty is not proof of truth. It is simply a feature of how thoughts are delivered. The mind does not label its thoughts with degrees of accuracy. It does not announce which ones are useful and which ones are misleading. It presents them all in the same voice, leaving you to decide what to do with them. And if you never pause to make that decision, you end up accepting everything by default. That acceptance becomes a habit, one that reinforces itself over time. The more you automatically believe your thoughts, the less likely you are to question them in the future. This is where a subtle shift becomes necessary, not a dramatic change, not an attempt to silence the mind, just a simple act of noticing. When a thought appears, instead of immediately stepping into it, you remain just outside of it. You observe its tone, its language, its certainty. You begin to realize that the confidence it carries is not always earned. Often, it is simply assumed. Once you see that clearly, the grip it has on you begins to loosen. It doesn't vanish completely, but it becomes far less convincing. It becomes something you can examine rather than something you must obey. There is another deeper layer that many people overlook. The mind is not only presenting thoughts, it is also reinforcing identity. When it repeatedly presents certain conclusions about you, especially negative ones, it slowly begins shaping how you see yourself. A single thought, repeated enough times, begins to feel like a description rather than an interpretation. It shifts from "this happened" to "this is who you are." And that shift is where the real damage begins. Because once a thought becomes tied to identity, it becomes much harder to challenge. It no longer feels like there's a voice that speaks constantly, and it's easy to mistake it for truth. It appears when everything becomes quiet. It replays mistakes and turns small failures into something deeply personal. It speaks with such certainty that questioning it rarely even crosses your mind. Over time, that voice becomes familiar, and whatever feels familiar slowly starts to feel true. There's a moment most people recognize very well. Nothing unusual is happening, yet your mind refuses to stop. It pulls back something you once said, something you once did, something you wish you could undo. And that voice doesn't just remind you of it, it judges you. It adds weight to it. It turns a simple moment into something that feels permanent. The unsettling part is that you trust it. But the Stoics saw this differently. They believed we are not disturbed by events themselves, but by the thoughts we form about those events. This means the voice in your mind isn't an authority. It's more like a narrator, one that can distort things just as easily as it can guide you. The real danger isn't that the voice exists, it's that most people were never taught how to respond to it. Think about a moment you regret. Not something dramatic, just something small and personal. Maybe you said something awkward. Maybe you delayed something important. Maybe you didn't act the way you wish you had. The moment passed, but your mind didn't move on. It replayed it, examined it again and again, and gradually attached meaning to it. What started as something simple slowly became heavier, almost like evidence that this one moment revealed something permanent about who you are. The more you replayed it, the more convincing it became. No one else needed to criticize you because the voice inside your head had already taken control, repeating the same lines with greater certainty each time. Eventually, it stopped feeling like a thought and started to feel like a conclusion, and that is where the real weight comes from, not from what happened, but from what your mind decided it meant. Something subtle happens in those moments that most people never pause to notice. Your mind isn't simply remembering events, it's interpreting them, it's shaping them and attaching meaning to them quietly. It takes something temporary and makes it feel permanent. A small mistake becomes a reflection of your intelligence. A missed opportunity becomes a reflection of your worth. A moment of hesitation becomes a reflection of your character. Not because those meanings are truly accurate, but because the mind automatically fills in the gaps, and once that meaning is attached, it sticks. You don't just remember what happened, you remember what you decided it meant about you. The Stoics understood this deeply. They noticed how quickly the mind moves from observation to judgment. One moment you're simply noticing something, the next moment you're defining it, and once that definition forms, it begins shaping everything that follows. Your mood shifts, your confidence drops, your actions begin to adjust, all because of a single thought that was never questioned. That is why these thoughts feel so convincing. They don't appear as possibilities, they appear as facts. The mind doesn't say this might mean something, it says this is exactly what it means. And because it sounds like your own voice, you trust it automatically. It feels natural, it feels justified. But that authority is not always earned, it is often assumed. Once you begin to see that clearly, something starts to change. You realize the voice in your head is not a perfect guide, but a storyteller, and a storyteller can distort things just as easily as it can explain them. Left unchecked, that storyteller builds patterns. It repeats the same interpretations again and again until they begin to feel like identity. You start expecting the same thoughts, anticipating the same judgments, and reacting in the same ways. Not because reality demands it, but because repetition made it familiar, and familiarity begins to feel like truth. But the moment you recognize that what you're hearing is interpretation rather than reality, you create distance. It is small at first, almost invisible, but it changes everything. You are no longer fully inside the thought. Instead, you are observing it. And in that space, something begins to open up. Once you can see a thought clearly, it loses some of its power over you. This is where a different kind of discipline begins. Not the kind that forces you to suppress thoughts or replace them with artificial positivity, but the kind that allows you to examine them. The Stoics never tried to silence the mind. They tried to understand it. They understood that peace doesn't come from eliminating thoughts, but from refusing to be ruled by them. And that doesn't require force. It requires awareness. Just a small pause, just enough to question what you're hearing before you automatically believe it. If you are trying to understand your own mind in that way, not to escape it, but to see it clearly, then subscribing becomes more than a simple action. It becomes a small step toward clarity, toward discipline, toward becoming someone who is not controlled by every thought that appears. Because the way you think shapes the way you live, and learning to see your thoughts clearly might be one of the most important things you ever do. The shift is subtle, but it is powerful. Instead of immediately accepting the voice, you begin to evaluate it. Instead of reacting instantly, you start observing. Instead of identifying with every thought, you begin to place a boundary between yourself and what your mind is producing. Over time, that boundary becomes stronger. The voice may still speak, It may still replay moments and attach meanings, but it no longer has complete authority. It becomes something you can hear without automatically obeying. This idea was captured in the reminder that you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realizing this is not merely philosophical, it is deeply practical. It means that while you cannot control what happens or what thoughts initially appear, you can control what you choose to do with them. You can decide whether to accept them, question them, or simply allow them to pass. And that decision, repeated consistently, begins to reshape the relationship you have with your own mind. What once felt overwhelming begins to feel manageable. What once felt like absolute truth begins to feel like a possibility instead, and what once controlled you slowly begins to lose its grip. Not because the voice disappeared, but because you stopped giving it unquestioned authority. You began to see it for what it really is, a process, not a verdict. In that recognition, the weight of those small moments begins to fade. They return to what they always were, temporary events, no longer carrying the burden of exaggerated meaning. Part of the answer lies in how the mind presents its thoughts. Your inner voice does not sound like a suggestion. It sounds like a conclusion. It arrives fully formed with a tone that feels certain, final, and strangely authoritative. When it says something like "you are not good enough" or "this will fail," it does not feel like a passing idea drifting through your awareness. It feels like something already decided, something already proven. Because it carries that tone, you rarely question it. You accept it not because you carefully examined it, but because it feels familiar. It sounds like you, and that resemblance alone gives it credibility. Over time, that pattern becomes automatic. A thought appears, it feels true, and you move forward as if it were a fact. There is a quiet efficiency in the way the mind works. It does not want to analyze every thought from the beginning, so it creates shortcuts. It learns to recognize patterns, respond quickly, and conserve effort. But that efficiency comes with a cost. When the mind becomes used to presenting thoughts as conclusions, it stops distinguishing between what is accurate and what is simply habitual. A repeated thought begins to feel like a verified one. The more often it appears, the less resistance it meets. It becomes easier to believe not because it is correct, but because it is familiar. This is how certain ideas about yourself begin to take root without ever being tested. They are not examined, they are absorbed. As Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Once that absorption happens, the voice in your head gains a quiet authority. It does not need to argue its case or provide evidence. It simply states something, and you follow. This is why even harsh thoughts can feel justified. They arrive with the same tone as your reasonable thoughts, the same certainty, the same internal voice. There is no clear distinction between guidance and distortion because both are delivered in the same way. Without that distinction, it becomes difficult to separate what deserves your attention from what does not. Everything feels equally valid simply because it originates from within. If you slow this process down even slightly, something begins to stand out. The tone of certainty is not proof of truth. It is simply a feature of how thoughts are delivered. The mind does not label its thoughts with degrees of accuracy. It does not announce which ones are useful and which ones are misleading. It presents them all in the same voice, leaving you to decide what to do with them. And if you never pause to make that decision, you end up accepting everything by default. When a harsh thought appears, the natural instinct is to respond immediately, to accept it, argue with it, or push it away. But the Stoic approach introduces a pause. a brief moment where you step back and simply recognize what is happening. A thought has appeared, nothing more. It has not proven itself. It has not justified its presence. It has simply entered your awareness. And in that moment, you have a choice. Not about whether the thought appears, because that is often outside your control, but about what you do with it once it does. That distinction is subtle, but essential. It separates what happens to you from what you actively participate in. This is where the question of control becomes central, not as an abstract idea, but as a practical filter. When a thought begins pulling your attention, you can quietly examine whether it relates to something you can actually influence. If it does not, engaging with it only drains your energy without changing anything. If it does, the focus shifts away from judgment and toward action. This redirection changes the role of the inner voice completely. It no longer exists simply to criticize or define you, but to point towards something that can be adjusted or improved. The same mental process that once trapped you in cycles of overthinking begins to guide you toward clarity and forward movement. This shift is not about becoming passive or indifferent. It is about becoming precise. Instead of reacting to every thought with equal intensity, you begin to allocate your attention more carefully. You start to see that some thoughts are simply noise, repetitions of old patterns that do not require engagement. Others point towards something useful, something that can be addressed through action. The challenge is not to eliminate the noise, but to recognize it for what it is. And that recognition becomes easier the more you practice observing rather than reacting. This idea is reflected in the reminder that we have power over our minds, not outside events. The meaning becomes clearer when you begin to apply it. You cannot stop thoughts from appearing, just as you cannot control everything happening around you. But you can decide how much authority those thoughts have. You can decide whether they are followed, examined, or simply allowed to pass. That decision, repeated consistently, begins to reshape your internal experience. It creates a sense of control that is not based on eliminating difficulty, but on responding to it differently. As this way of thinking develops, the harshness of the inner voice begins to lose its impact. Not because the thoughts themselves become softer, but because your relationship to them changes. They no longer feel like commands. They feel like inputs, suggestions that can be accepted or rejected. The emotional weight they carry starts to fade because you are no longer treating them as final judgments. You are treating them as temporary events that can be examined and changed. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts." Over time, this creates a noticeable shift in how you move through your day. Situations that once triggered long cycles of overthinking begin to pass more quickly. Moments that once led to harsh self-criticism become opportunities for adjustment instead. The mind does not become silent, but it becomes more orderly. It becomes something you can navigate rather than something that controls you. And that sense of navigation, the ability to step back and choose your direction, is where a deeper kind of confidence begins to form. It is not loud or dramatic, it does not announce itself, but it is steady. It comes from knowing that even when the voice in your head becomes harsh, you are not obligated to follow it. You can observe it, question it, and redirect your attention toward what actually matters. In doing so, you transform the role of that voice. It stops being a constant source of judgment and becomes a tool that, when used carefully, can guide you forward with clarity instead of holding you in place through doubt. The reason many people remain stuck in that cycle is because negativity can feel useful even when it isn't. It creates the impression that you are being honest with yourself, that by pointing out your flaws and mistakes in the harshest possible way, you are somehow improving. There is a strange comfort in that harshness. a belief that if you are strict enough with yourself, you will avoid failure, avoid embarrassment, and avoid falling short again. It feels like discipline, it feels like responsibility, but beneath that feeling, something else is happening. The constant pressure, the repeated criticism, the relentless focus on what is wrong begins to slow you down instead of pushing you forward. What appears to be effort slowly turns into resistance. The mind convinces you that this approach is necessary. It tells you that without this level of self-criticism, you would become careless, unmotivated, or indifferent. It frames harshness as a form of control, as if being hard on yourself is the only way to stay disciplined. Because of that, letting go of that tone can feel risky. It can feel like lowering your standards or giving yourself permission to fail. But if you observe the results carefully, a different pattern appears. Constant self-criticism does not create clarity. It creates hesitation. It fills your mind with noise, making it harder to focus on what truly needs to be done. Instead of moving forward, you become stuck analyzing, doubting, and second-guessing. This is where the difference between correction and attack becomes important. Correction is precise. It identifies what needs to change and directs your attention toward action. It is calm, focused, and practical. Attack, on the other hand, is broad and emotional. It does not guide you, it overwhelms you. It does not isolate the problem, it turns the problem into something personal. Instead of saying this approach didn't work, it says you are the problem. And once that shift happens, it becomes much harder to act. Because when the issue is framed as something inherent, something tied to who you are, there is no clear path forward. There is only waiting. There is a quiet shift that happens when you begin to move away from that pattern. Instead of asking how to silence the voice, you start to ask how to make it useful. That shift in perspective changes everything. It moves the focus away from control and toward function. The voice does not need to disappear. It needs to become more precise. It needs to stop speaking in generalizations and start focusing on specifics. A useful inner voice does not make broad statements about your worth or your abilities. It points to actions. It identifies what can be adjusted, what can be improved, what can be done differently next time. This kind of precision removes unnecessary emotion from the process. It does not ignore mistakes, but it does not exaggerate them either. It treats them as information rather than as evidence of failure. And that difference, though subtle, has a powerful effect on how you respond. When the focus is on action, movement becomes easier. You are no longer weighed down by judgment. You are directed by clarity. The energy that was once spent on self-criticism becomes available for something more useful, something that actually leads to progress. There is a well-known idea that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. That suffering often comes from the way the mind expands small issues into larger ones, adding layers of meaning that were never there to begin with. When your inner voice is imprecise, it does exactly that. It takes a specific situation and turns it into a general conclusion. It moves from what happened to what it means about you. And in doing so, it increases the emotional weight of the moment. But when the voice becomes precise, that expansion stops. The situation remains what it is, nothing more, nothing less. And that makes it easier to respond to. As you begin to apply this consistently, the results become noticeable. You start to act more quickly because there is less hesitation. You make adjustments without turning them into something personal. You begin to see mistakes as part of a process rather than as something that defines you. The voice in your head still speaks, but it speaks differently. It becomes more focused, more grounded, less emotional. It starts to resemble a guide rather than a critic. This does not mean that everything becomes easy. There are still moments where the old patterns return, where the voice becomes harsh again, where the tendency to criticize yourself feels automatic. But the difference is that you recognize it. You see it for what it is, a habit, not a necessity. And that recognition allows you to step back and adjust. It allows you to return to precision, to bring the focus back to what can actually be done. Over time, this approach creates a different kind of discipline, one that is not based on pressure or fear, but on clarity and direction. It allows you to hold yourself accountable without turning that accountability into something destructive. It keeps you moving even when things are not perfect, even when mistakes happen. And in that movement, you begin to see that growth does not come from being harsh with yourself, but from being clear with yourself. That clarity changes the relationship you have with your inner voice. It no longer feels like something that holds you back. It becomes something that helps you move forward. And that shift from criticism to direction is what transforms the voice from something that limits you into something that supports you, not by being softer, but by being more useful. Over time, the relationship you have with your inner voice begins to change in a way that is almost unnoticeable at first. There is no clear moment where everything suddenly feels different. Instead, it happens gradually through small shifts in how you respond, how you observe, and how you interpret what appears in your mind. The same thoughts still come and go. The same patterns still try to repeat themselves, but something about your position in relation to them is no longer the same. You are no longer standing inside every thought, reacting to it as if it were a command. You are standing slightly outside, aware of it, able to see it without immediately becoming it. And that distance, even if it is small, begins to change everything. At first, this change feels subtle. The voice still speaks, still presents its conclusions with confidence, still tries to pull your attention in familiar directions. But now, there is a pause, where there wasn't one before, a moment of recognition, a quiet awareness that what you are hearing is not necessarily truth, but interpretation. That awareness creates space, and within that space, something new becomes possible. You begin to choose your response instead of falling into it automatically. You begin to see that thoughts can pass through your mind without needing to define you. And that realization, once it settles in, starts to reshape the way you experience yourself. The mind that once felt overwhelming begins to feel more structured. Not because it has become silent, but because it has become something you can navigate. The noise is still there, but it no longer has the same authority. It no longer dictates your reactions in the same way. You start to recognize patterns as they appear, to see certain thoughts as repetitions rather than revelations. And when you see them clearly, they lose some of their impact. They become familiar in a different way, not as truths to follow, but as patterns to observe. This is where the idea of mastering the self begins to take on real meaning. It is not about controlling every thought or eliminating every negative impulse. It is about refusing to be ruled by them. It is about understanding that your mind will produce all kinds of content, some useful, some not, and that your role is not to accept everything it offers, but to decide what deserves your attention. That decision becomes easier over time as you become more familiar with the nature of your own thoughts. You start to see which ones lead to clarity and which ones lead to confusion, which ones move you forward and which ones keep you stuck. There is a kind of quiet confidence that grows from this process. Not the kind that comes from external validation or temporary success, but the kind that comes from knowing you can handle your own mind. You no longer feel at the mercy of every thought that appears. You know that even if the voice becomes harsh, even if old patterns resurface, you have the ability to step back and respond differently. That ability does not remove difficulty, but it changes your relationship to it. It makes it manageable. It gives you a sense of stability that does not depend on everything being perfect. As Seneca observed, we suffer more often in imagination than in reality. This shift is often misunderstood. Many people believe that peace comes from silencing the mind, from reaching a point where negative thoughts no longer appear. But that is not how the mind works. Thoughts will continue to arise just as external events will continue to happen. The real change is not in the absence of those thoughts, but in your response to them. It is in the recognition that you are not obligated to follow every thought to its conclusion. You are not required to engage with every interpretation your mind produces. You have the ability to let thoughts pass without attaching yourself to them. There is a reminder that the happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts. That quality is not determined by eliminating negative thoughts entirely, but by how you relate to them. It is determined by whether you accept them blindly or examine them carefully. It is determined by whether you allow them to define you or see them as temporary events within your awareness. And as you begin to take more responsibility for that relationship, the overall tone of your inner experience begins to shift. The mind becomes less of a battlefield and more of a space you can move through with awareness. You still encounter difficult thoughts. You still face moments of doubt or hesitation, but they do not overwhelm you in the same way. They pass through and you remain. You observe and then you decide. That process becomes more natural over time, more consistent, more reliable. And with that consistency comes a deeper sense of control, not over everything that happens, but over how you respond to what happens within you. Eventually, you begin to see that the real transformation was never about changing the voice itself. It was about changing your position in relation to it. The voice can still speak, still present its interpretations, still try to guide or mislead, but it no longer has the final say. It is no longer the authority it once felt like. And that shift from being controlled by your thoughts to being able to observe and direct them is where true change takes place. Not in silence, but in awareness. Not in elimination, but in mastery. In the end, the voice in your head was never your enemy. It was a tool you were never taught how to use, and the moment you stop obeying every thought, you start becoming someone who can actually direct their life instead of reacting to it. That's where real strength begins, quiet, steady, and completely within your control. If this resonated with you, there's another video on your screen right now that will take this even deeper and help you build that inner clarity step by step. Stay with it. That acceptance becomes a habit, one that reinforces itself over time. The more automatically you believe your thoughts, the less likely you are to question them in the future. This is where a subtle shift becomes necessary, not a dramatic change and not an attempt to silence the mind, but a simple act of noticing. When a thought appears, instead of immediately stepping into it, you remain just outside of it. You observe its tone, its language, its certainty. You begin to see that the confidence it carries is not always earned, it is often assumed. And once you see that clearly, the grip it has on you begins to loosen. It does not disappear, but it becomes less convincing. It becomes something you can examine rather than something you must obey. There is also a deeper layer to this that often goes unnoticed. The mind is not only presenting thoughts, it is also reinforcing identity. When it repeats certain conclusions about you, especially negative ones, it slowly shapes how you see yourself. A single thought repeated often enough begins to feel like a description rather than an interpretation. It shifts from "this happened" to "this is who you are," and that shift is where the real damage occurs. Because once a thought becomes tied to identity, it becomes much harder to challenge. It no longer feels like something external. It feels like something essential, But identity, like thought, is not fixed in the way it often appears to be. It is influenced by what you repeatedly accept as true. If you allow every harsh conclusion to define you, your sense of self will gradually begin to reflect those conclusions. But if you start to question them, even slightly, that reflection begins to change. This is not about replacing negative thoughts with forced positivity. It is about removing the automatic belief that gives those thoughts their power. It is about creating enough space to decide whether they truly deserve to stay. This idea is captured in a simple reminder. It is not things themselves that disturb us, but our opinions about them. The implication is direct and practical. What you experience internally is not determined only by what happens, but by how you interpret it. And those interpretations are not fixed. They are shaped, repeated, and reinforced through habit, which means they can also be examined and adjusted gradually and with awareness. As that awareness grows, the relationship you have with your inner voice begins to change. It no longer feels like an unquestionable authority. It becomes something closer to a tool. The thoughts still appear, and the tone may still carry certainty, but your response is no longer automatic. You begin to notice the gap between what is said and what is actually true, and inside that gap, there is choice. That choice is quiet, but it is powerful. It allows you to step back instead of reacting immediately. It allows you to evaluate instead of blindly accepting. Over time, it weakens the pattern that once felt so strong. The voice in your head does not lose its ability to speak, but it loses the ability to define you without your permission. It becomes part of your experience, not the ruler of it. And that shift, although subtle at first, changes the direction of everything that follows. As Epictetus put it, it is not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. This is where the Stoic perspective becomes powerful in a very practical sense. They never tried to eliminate thoughts or silence the mind because they understood that such attempts often create more struggle. Instead, they focused on how to relate to what appears internally. They practiced examining their thoughts with calm detachment, almost as if they were observing something that needed to be understood rather than something that needed to be obeyed. This approach removes urgency. It removes the feeling that every thought demands a reaction. In that space, a different kind of clarity begins to form. You begin to see that not every thought carries the same weight, even if it feels that way in the moment.